Hello and welcome to the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum's live virtual programming. My name is Kara and I'm an educator here at the Intrepid Museum located in New York City, and I'll be leading you through today's program, Jobs on Deck. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about life on board of a Navy ship and specific roles that everyone played during that time. Now, just as a reminder, the museum's live streams are free, but if you'd like to support us in delivering some of this amazing content, please click on the link located in the chat or in the comments, depending on if you're on Facebook or YouTube. Now, feel free to use the chat to tell us where you're tuning in from, where you're from, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to answer along with some of the questions we'll be asking throughout the program. Again, my name is Kara, and I'm an educator here at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, where our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire the youth. So let's get started. All right, so just to get us started with a little bit of background information, this is the Intrepid Museum. We are located on the West Side Highway in the Hudson River, right between New Jersey and New York. And what makes our museum really interesting is that we are located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. Now, just a couple of really neat things about it. If you're walking along the West Side Highway, you cannot miss us. We're about 913 feet long. If you were to take the Intrepid and stand her on the side, it would actually be as tall as the Chrysler Building. If you were to turn it back over, you could actually play 3 games of football at the same time. 3 football fields fit on top of the Intrepid. Now, from the tippy top that you see here on the picture to the very bottom deck, it's about 8 stories tall. So the Intrepid began its construction in 1943, 6 days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We finished about 18 months after that, and the Intrepid was a part of World War II, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War, but also served as a recovery vessel for NASA during the space race in the 1960s. Now, at the time, it was still very impractical to send those airplanes across oceans from continent to continent, so vessels like this were created to carry those aircrafts across the ocean. Now, can anybody in the chat tell me what we would call a really large ship that could carry aircrafts from one place to another? I'll give you a hint, too. They actually fly off of the ship, and they land on it, too. Let me know in the chat if you know what that's called, a big vessel that can carry aircraft across the ocean. If you said aircraft carrier, you would be correct. So not only was Intrepid carrying these aircrafts, but they were also flying off, and they were landing on the back, just like a floating airport. Now, the Intrepid served from 1943 to 1974 before becoming a museum in 1982. So we're going to take a look at what's inside of the Intrepid Museum, starting with our chairs exhibit. So this might just look like a really interesting exhibit about chairs, but it tells a really amazing story about what life would have been like back when Intrepid was in service. So I want us to take a look at these chairs here, and I want you to tell me in the chat, which chair do you think is the most boring chair? One that is just kind of like your average Joe chair. And I'll kind of give you a hint that even though there were a lot of physical jobs on board, there were also jobs that required a lot of sitting. So if you can tell me in the chat, which chair do you think is the most boring, or maybe not boring, but just ordinary? Now, if you would have said, find my mouse here, this green chair right here, you would have been correct. So like I said, that even though there were a lot of physical jobs on board, yeah, I see Cassie in the chat is saying the green chair. Awesome. So like I said, if you would have been on board, of course, there's a lot of physical jobs, but there were also a lot of office jobs. There were also a lot of seats in the mess deck. There were also chairs for the radio operators, the radio men, administrative personnel who were doing paperwork. You'd also find these chairs in their offices and in their room. So this was just an ordinary chair, but what's really interesting about it is that when engineers are designing chairs like this, they have to put a lot of thought into it. Remember, this chair is on board of a ship, so it's got to be light enough that you can pick up and kind of move it around when you need to, but it also has to be heavy enough to where if a big wave comes or the water is really choppy, you don't want all these chairs kind of sliding around all aboard the ship. So it's got to have a little bit of weight to it. So the next chair that I want us to look at, so I want us to find the chair that is the most comfortable. Let me know in the chat if you see a chair that's nice and cozy that you could relax on. It's got some cushion to it maybe. Let me know in the chat a chair that you think is cozy and comfortable. Like I said, it's got a lot of cushion on it. If you would have said this brown chair right here, you would have been on the right track. So this chair could actually be found in the pilot ready room. Now, basically, pilots would spend hours in this room prepping for their missions, right? And in between those missions, they'd actually be in here relaxing, right? And so these were some of the most comfortable chairs aboard the ship. They also had a desk attachment that would swivel up and they could use it to write down when they were learning about their missions. I like to think about it like assignments or homework. And then underneath, there was also a compartment that they could put all their materials or all their extra stuff. Now, today in the museum, you can actually see a pilot ready room located in the museum, and it kind of shows you what it would look like in the 1960s, 1970s. I really like this picture because it's really in action. You can see that they are wearing their goggles, they're wearing their vests. It looks like they're almost ready to get going. They've got their headgear and helmets ready to go. I think it's very interesting. Looks like they're about ready to get up and go into their planes, right? Awesome. So going back to our chairs, I want us to look for a chair that is slightly intimidating. Now, I think there's two chairs here that are kind of scary. So I want us to look at the chair that's intimidating, right? Maybe it has some straps. Let me know in the chat which one you think is scary or intimidating. Like I said, it's got some straps. It's got a lot of metal on it. Might make you feel uneasy or a little intimidating. Now, I see some of us said this chair right here. Now, can anybody tell me in the chat where you might find this chair on Intrepid? Where might it be located? And I'll give you a hint. It has to do with pilots since we've been talking about pilots. Where do you think that you would find this chair? And I'll give you a hint. It's called an ejection seat. So where would we find this seat located on Intrepid? So we were just talking about pilots. And this seat could be found inside of an airplane. Now, the Intrepid could hold about 100 airplanes between the hangar deck and the flight deck. Yeah, I see Rebecca says the one in the middle, right? The ejection seat. Intrepid could hold about 100 airplanes. And when the airplanes weren't being used, they were being stored inside the hangar deck. Now, this seat, like I said, was located inside of the airplane. And if the pilot happened to get in a bind or maybe needed to make a quick escape, he'd actually pull that handle on the top there. It's black and yellow. Hold that one, or he'd pull the one in between his legs. And the canopy above the pilot would actually pop off, and that ejection seat would go off. There was actually like a little explosive or a little bomb located underneath the seat that would go off and it'd actually pop them out. And it'd look a little something like this. Now, eventually, the seat would separate from the pilot, and the pilot would be wearing his parachute because he's going to be flying over the water. He's going to use that parachute, and he's going to slowly make his way back down into the ocean. So let's go back to our chairs and let's imagine that our pilot was in his ready room, getting comfy in the cozy chair, learning about his mission, pops into his airplane. He's in his ejection seat, needs to make a quick getaway. So he pops out, separates, and he uses his parachute to come back down. So he's hanging out in the ocean waiting for Intrepid to pick him up. Unfortunately, the Intrepid is miles away, can't get him immediately. So another ship comes to pick him up. That ship picks up the pilot, calls the Intrepid and says, hey, we have your pilot. You need to come pick him up. Intrepid says, no problem. We're on our way. Can anybody see a chair that could maybe be used to transfer that pilot from one ship back to the Intrepid? Let me know in the chat if you see a chair that could be used to transfer him from the ship that he's on back to Intrepid. Oh, and I see Rebecca says that the one at the left looks like it belongs on a zip line. So you are not too far off. This chair is the Highline Chair, and it would be used like this. Now, this picture makes me very uncomfortable. I am terrified of the ocean. So just looking at the waves crashing and moving along the bottom makes me very uneasy. But you can see that there is a man in that Highline Chair, and he would be transferred from one ship back to Intrepid. So some of the difficulties with this chair, imagine just looking at this picture, you've got those waves that are crashing back and forth, right? Your ships also have to be going at the same speed. If one's going too fast and one's going too slow, that line is going to be turning at an angle, right? If our ships are too close, then you risk dunking that pilot in the water, right? If you go too far, then that pilot line might snap and that pilot might fall in. So there's a lot going on with the Highline Chair. One of our really funny stories at Intrepid, I think it's really funny, at Intrepid was one time our pilot got picked up by another ship and he needed to get back to Intrepid. So that ship tells Intrepid, hey, we have one of your pilots. And the Intrepid goes, okay, send him back. And the ship goes, but we want to trade. We'll trade him for ice cream. Can you send us over some ice cream and we'll send you your pilot back? And Intrepid goes, yeah, no problem, wink, wink. And so the Intrepid takes ice cream and then they shave soap on top to weigh it down, make it feel like there's a lot more ice cream. So of course, when the first ship gets it, they're not happy. They go, okay, fine, here's your pilot. When they send that pilot, they move the ship a little bit closer, dunking that pilot in the water. I feel really bad for that pilot because I feel like it wasn't his fault that he got dunked in the water. He didn't deserve that, right? So on board, we also have chairs like this one at the far end. Can anybody in the chat tell me what that chair might be? It's that green and black one there. You've probably seen it. This might have been one of the scary chairs that you were thinking of. I know it's definitely a scary chair for me. That would be a dentist chair. Now, these sailors were on board for quite a while, so that's plenty of time to get a toothache or maybe a cleaning. So there was always a dental department on ship, right? And they could do everything from root canals to dentures to cleanings. So just in case anything ever happened, there was always dentists on board. There were also always barbers, right? The Navy had a very strict dress code and uniform. So they were always making sure that their barbers were always there so that they could get haircuts. Okay? Awesome. So this is a good place for a question break. So does anybody have any questions? How many people served aboard Intrepid? Awesome. So there were about 3,200 men on board the Intrepid. Now these men would be on there from anywhere from 6 to 9 months, and they were anywhere average age of 18 to 23 years old. So they were really young. This is the first time that they were leaving home for the first time. So there was always a post office too on board. They could write letters to their friends and family, because remember, the Intrepid started in 1943. There wasn't email or anything like that they could write back to their families. So they always had a post office on board. There was also a radio station too to make them feel a little more at home as well. Good question. Were there doctors on board? Yes. So, of course, if there's a dental department, there's going to be a sick bay. And if these sailors were sick or needed to be treated or needed a checkup, they could always go down to the sick bay. There were also surgeons on board, just in case. Remember, this is a ship out during World War II, the Vietnam and the Cold War. So there were men coming back who were injured. There would always be a doctor on board. Awesome. So as you can see, Intrepid was like a city at sea. I mentioned that you would find doctors, barbers, you could even find a general store, and you could buy engagement rings there as well. There was a post office, there was a radio station. So basically anything in your community that you could think of would be on board the Intrepid. But earlier I talked a little bit about how the Intrepid's purpose was an aircraft carrier. It was carrying these aircrafts, and we're going to take a look at one of those airplanes that we have at the museum. So this is the Grumman Tbm Avenger, and this was one of the primary planes during World War II. It's also the oldest plane in our collection. So tell me in the chat, what are some interesting things that you notice about this plane? Maybe its color, the way it's designed, how old it is, just anything that you find interesting. Let me know in the chat about this plane. Have you ever seen planes like this before? If you go to the airport, do you find planes like this? Anything that you find interesting about it. So I noticed that the first thing that I notice when I look at it are the wings, right? Now they're not broken. I know a lot of us tend to think that they're broken, but they're actually folded. If you wanted to try this little experiment with me, you can. If you were to take your arms, pretend that they're airplane wings, and stick them out nice and wide, try and turn in a circle and see how many things you hit, right? I know that if I try to turn in a circle, I hit my wall, hit my computer, you might hit your computer, right? But if you take those airplane wings and you fold them in and then move side to side, are you going to hit anything? Probably not. You're less likely to run into anything. Same thing with the Avenger. Like I said earlier, you could have about 100 airplanes on board of the ship between the hangar deck and the flight deck. So you had to fit a lot of these airplanes in that tiny space. So folding their wings kind of helped them do that. I also noticed the shading and the color of the airplane. Now, that's what we call counter shading, and it's a type of camouflage. The job of this Avenger was to hold that 2,000 pound torpedo and actually drop it. But the thing about the Avenger is it's not very fast. It's about 270, goes about 270 miles per hour. It's holding that torpedo, and its job is a torpedo bomber. So it has to get really, really low to its enemy and has to accurately drop it. So it's going to need all the extra help that it can get. One of that is the color I was talking about, that counter shading. So if this airplane is flying over you and you're underneath looking up, you want that belly of that airplane to kind of camouflage with the clouds above. If you're flying over that airplane, you want it to camouflage with the ocean underneath, right? Like I said, it's really slow. It's got a very important job, and it has to get very close to the enemy. So it's going to need as much help hiding as it possibly can get. It's also nicknamed the turkey because it's really big, it's really clunky, and it's really slow, right? So this plane could hold 3 people. Now we know that one of them has to be the pilot, right? It wasn't a self-driving plane. But what do you think those other 2 people are? Let me know in the chat if you know who else this airplane would hold, or maybe what their jobs were. You definitely have the pilot, and then you'd have 2 more people located at the back end of the airplane. And maybe this will give you a hint of what that job is. So flying in the Avenger, obviously you'd have your pilot, but you would also have your radio operator and your navigator or your tail gunner, right? Now your tail gunner would sit in this ball turret right here, and it would sit on the far end of the Avenger. Now this could actually turn 360 degrees, and that gun in the front would actually go up and down. So it actually had mechanisms too that even though it could turn 360, it wouldn't shoot off the tail or any part of the plane that it was really important, right? And that would be located at this far end right here. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Avenger, that planes had ejection seats, right? But ejection seats didn't come out till about the jet age when technology became a little more advanced. So the Avenger didn't have an ejection seat. They were in trouble and they were in a bind. They would actually have to go into the belly of the plane, get their parachutes, and jump out. So these men had to have nerves of steel. I could not imagine flying an airplane like this. Awesome. So, of course, if you've got airplanes on board and they're going out and they're working on these missions, you're also going to have mechanics on board, right? Make that a little bit bigger. So these, the Intrepid is sailing out in the ocean, and there's no part store, there's no mechanics out there. You have to bring all of that with you if you've got to repair a plane. And you have to carry all your supplies with you. Now, you can see from this photo that it was a group effort. You've got that one man on the propeller, right, working on it from there. But you also have the man on the tail, on the nose end as well. You've got those men at the bottom who are kind of observing, making sure everything is going as planned. And then there's that one man to the right that looks like he's painting something on the wing of the plane. So this was a very group effort to make sure that everything was going well. There was also a repair division on board the Intrepid, whose job was to repair paint, weld parts of the ship that needed fixing, anything to keep that ship afloat. There was also an engineering department, but you also had a machine shop on board as well. Like I said, there are no part stores in the middle of the ocean that you can stop by if you were needed a supply. So our next stop is going to be the forecastle of the ship, and that's short for forecastle, meaning the front, ship lingo for the front of the ship. So let me know in the chat, what do you think the purpose of this room is, just by looking at it? What do you think the purpose is? And I'll make that a little bit bigger so you can see it. I automatically notice that there are chains from one end to the other that are kind of wrapped around these red pieces here. I see in the back there is what looks like a big ball of yarn, right? Maybe around a spool. And this is the anchor chain room. Yeah, I see Susie saying it's the area to drop the anchors. That'd be correct. This is the anchor chain room. Now, the Intrepid didn't drop the anchors very often because there was always a port that they could pull up to. But in the event that they did, they would drop anchor. Now, this was a very, very dangerous job. And basically, you would release the brake, and you would have this one man who's got this long string here. He was in charge of pulling the pin. Now, once that pin was pulled on that pelican hook, and I'll show you in a minute what that pelican hook looks like, he was in charge pulling that pin out. That pelican hook would open up, and you'd have that, well, actually, you'd pull the pin, and then the man with the sledgehammer would hit it really hard, and that pelican hook would open up, and it would release the chain. Now, these chains are wrapped around those big red pieces called wildcats, and here you can see a better picture of that pelican hook and the pin on top. So that pin would be pulled, that sledgehammer would be hit down, and that pelican hook would open up. Now, like I said, at the end you would have these huge anchors located at that far end of the chain. And basically, when that pelican hook was released, those chains are going down very fast. Gravity is helping them hurl down to the ocean. And there'd be two men on a brake wheel trying to slow that down and stop the anchor, because potentially if you let that anchor keep going, the weight of it would actually rip the chains out of the welded wall. So being in this forecastle would be a very, very, in the anchor chain room would be a very dangerous job, right? So these red pieces right here that I was talking about are the wildcats. Now, done incorrectly, this could be a very dangerous job, but of course these men knew exactly what they're doing. Now, if you visit the Intrepid today and you walk around the anchor chain room, you can see a lot of this sailor art, and this actually dates back to the 1970s. You get a Roadrunner here, and it says "Meet Me." There's also sailor art on the wall as well. You can see there's an anchor, and it kind of just makes them feel a little bit more at home. If you visit the Intrepid today, you can actually touch and feel everything in this room. It's a really neat experience to be able to touch everything, and it's really hands-on. Now, back when the Intrepid was in service back in the early 1940s, this room was actually exposed. There was no walls or anything in here protecting those men from the elements. There's a really interesting story. And back in February of 1944, the Intrepid was struck by a Japanese torpedo, and it actually damaged one of the rudders. Now, Intrepid tried to keep going, but it kept getting blown off course because that rudder was stuck, and they were actually kind of turning in circles. So the sailors on board actually looked everywhere on ship for any kind of canvas material, and they ended up creating this huge sail. And they used it to kind of guide the Intrepid back to Pearl Harbor. They essentially were limping back. But they eventually made it back to Pearl Harbor, and then Intrepid was sent to California, where she was repaired. She went back into action just 4 months after that damaged rudder. Alrighty, so this is a good place for a question break. Are the anchors still being used today? So if you come and visit the Intrepid, or you're walking down that west side highway, you'll see that our anchors are actually pulled up, and you can kind of see what they look like. They're massive. Outside of the ship. Now, during low tide, the Intrepid is actually kind of sitting in the mud, but during high tide, you can actually feel it kind of floating very little. It's really creaky and it slightly moves. But the ship had 4 propellers. Those are now gone. So like I said, we're kind of sitting in the mud during low tide, but just in case, we are actually tied down to the pier using mooring lines. So if going back to this picture, if you look in that back part where those giant ropes are, they're just these big nylon ropes that are actually tied down to the pier and keep the ship from floating away. So good question. How long were the chains? So the chains are about 1,000 feet long. And I forgot to mention earlier, each one of those links are massive. They're about this big, and they weigh roughly about 150 pounds. So it's a 1,000-foot chain made up of these links that are about 150 pounds each. Then at the end, you have those anchors that each weigh about 15 tons. So they're really long and they're very, very heavy. And like I said, if those were just to keep going, you'd actually risk ripping them out of the wall if they didn't kind of break them to keep them from going down into the ocean. Awesome. So now that we've spent a little time in one of the dangerous areas of the ship, we're going to go to one of my favorite areas, the mess deck. And here in the mess deck is where the sailors would, it's basically their cafeteria. This is where they would enjoy their nice meals. I love this picture because it kind of shows you the decorations that they had in the mess deck. You can see in the back it says Fighting Iron. It's kind of Western themed. It kind of boosts morale. I think it was a good way to kind of break up the mundaneness of being on a steel ship all day long, was to kind of have these decorated rooms, right? So we're going to look at where this food was prepared for all these 3,000 men aboard the ship. And that area is called the Galley. So if you want to tell me in the chat something interesting that you notice about this room here. I'll make it a little bit bigger for us. Something interesting that you notice. Take note of the size of the equipment in here. Or is it any different from your kitchen at home? Do you see any similarities, any differences between your kitchen at home and the galley deck that you see here? Let me know in the chat. So the chefs and bakers on board of Intrepid would actually spend about 15 hours a day here. Remember, there was about 3,200 men aboard, which means that was a lot of food being prepared. 3,000 men, 3 times a day, that's almost 9,000 meals a day. That's an insane amount of food. And I see somebody mentioning that there's a huge dough mixer in the back because we're making large quantities of food, right? Each recipe card made about 100 portions. So they'd have to divide the number of men by the number of portions to figure out how much of each recipe they were going to make. Too much, and you've got a lot of food wasted. Too little, and not everybody got fed. So this was almost a science, right? They also had special holidays that they'd celebrate on Intrepid as well. Thanksgiving and Christmas were really big. So they also always had special menus. Again, it was a really good way to boost morale. These men are gone from 6 to 9 months, missing holidays, missing their family. It's a good way to kind of boost morale. I was reading the other day about how they would make about 700 loaves of bread per day for the sailors. That was a lot of bread. Now, celebrations were also a big thing on board. You can't have a celebration without cake. Now, some of these celebrations included successfully landing aircrafts, which is really hard and a really huge deal. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Intrepid's commissioning, right, and their anniversary or birthday every year, and having astronauts on board. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about how Intrepid served as a recovery vessel for NASA. We were lucky enough to pick up Gus Grissom and John Young back in 1965. You can see there on the right, picking up their space capsule during the Gemini missions. So, of course, an awesome cake was made for them. And you can see them using their military sabers to cut through that because just a knife isn't just going to do it. You need an actual saber. Again, things like Intrepid's anniversary were celebrated. This giant cake wouldn't be put in a giant oven. It would actually be made up of mini cakes. And just looking at this recipe card here, you can see that just for one of those mini cakes, right, it would serve about 100 portions. It would take 4 pounds of flour and 4 pounds of sugar. That is a crazy amount of flour and sugar for these cakes, right? And these cakes would actually take about a week to make. That giant one would take about a week to make after making all these mini ones that would add up to that giant one. Again, you've got to do a lot of math to make sure that everybody gets fed. I also find it really interesting, if you look at this recipe card, that it is vegan. There are no eggs and there's no milk or butter in this recipe card because you didn't want to take a whole lot of extra eggs, a whole lot of extra milk. Things could go bad, and you didn't want to keep all that with you. These cakes were also so massive that they would actually have to use the bomb elevator to actually move them up and down the ship because they were just so big, and it took more than one person. If you take a look at this picture, and I'll zoom in for us, you can see it says, "Congratulations, USS Intrepid," and it says first anniversary at the bottom. So it's a huge cake. On top, you can see there's a mini version of Intrepid with a little mini flight deck on top too. I think it's very cute. So now that we've had a chance to look at the inside of the ship, I'm going to take us to the flight deck. And here on the flight deck, if you look at the very, very top there, you can see that thing called the island. And it kind of sits right in the middle of Intrepid, right? If you put it way to the one end, might be lopsided. So it stays right there in the middle. And the island is kind of like the brains of the ship, right? You could find the ship's navigators in there, the admiral when he was there, and the captain. The navigators would use equipment like radar, charts, devices to plot coordinates, and they were responsible for basically making sure that the ship was on the right track and getting to where they needed to be at all times. The job was very important. You can also find the navigator's seat located in the island. You can see that big blue chair there. And basically this piece of the ship sticks out on the starboard side. And it's one of the few places on the ship that you can see the whole length of the ship. And basically they were in charge for making sure that the Intrepid was coming into port easily. And I like to point out that little circle window off to the right. When the Intrepid was first built, this whole area had actually been open to the elements. So that little window there was exposed, and they've got that nice steel plate that you can just lift up and cover it just in case anything would happen. Now, from the navigation seat, you can also monitor the underway replenishment. So basically, if you were out at sea and you needed more supplies or materials, you could transfer things from one ship to the other, basically using that same zip line mentality that we did when we were using the Highline Chair. Next, we have the pilot's house here. And this was the main area where you would control the ship's path, right? So you would have somebody on that big wheel right there called a helm. And the helm was used to turn the rudder, and the rudder goes side to side, and that helm would control the direction that the ship would be going. And the speed was actually controlled down in the engine room. So you'd have one man controlling the helm, and you'd have one man sending a telegraph down to the engine room telling the crew down there how fast they needed to be going. So what's really interesting about this area is that if that whole island had been taken down, there was actually another identical set like this located at the far end of the Intrepid. Now, they would have a secondary, it's called secondary con, and they'd have a whole area that was exactly like this, just in case the island went down, they could control the ship from the far end. In the event that that went down, you would also have another area that would have another identical set, and then another area that you can control the ship. So there was always a plan B, C, D, E, F, just in case, right? And then, of course, located in the island, you could also find the captain. He was in charge of every person on board of the Intrepid. There were also 31 captains during Intrepid's service. And so the captain would sit in this blue chair here when he was monitoring the planes taking off and landing. He could see the front of the ship where the planes were taking off, and through that giant, basically rear view mirror, he could see the planes coming in as well. So this sounds like a good spot for a question break. Was one person in charge of steering all the time? So no, there wasn't one man just sitting there steering 24 hours a day. There were actually 4 men. They were called helmsmen because the big wheel is called a helm. You had 4 helmsmen, and they'd actually take turns in 4-hour shifts switching off, so not one person was in charge all the time of sailing this Intrepid. How fast could Intrepid travel? So the top speed was about 33 to 44 knots, and that's about, top speed was about 40 miles per hour. Cruising speed was about 15 knots or 17 miles per hour. And you're probably thinking, what's a knot? I don't really drive boats or ships, right? So a knot is 1 nautical mile, and 1 nautical mile is equal to 1 minute of latitude. So you don't have like knot miles per hour, it's just 1 knot, and that is equal to 1.15 miles per hour. Awesome. So now that we've talked a lot about the captain watching and monitoring these planes coming in and out, we're going to take a closer look at the Intrepid's flight deck, where those planes were actually taking off and they were landing. Now, the flight deck could actually be the most dangerous part of the ship. It was also the most important. Like I said, if the island came down, there were also other places on the ship that you could control the rudders. But if the flight deck went out, the whole point of the Intrepid kind of didn't exist. So you needed the flight deck. It was the most important part. That's where we were launching our airplanes, making sure their pilots went on missions, right? So the Intrepid's flight deck, if you were to go to an airport, right, their runways are thousands of feet long. The Intrepid's only about 913 feet. So it's not a lot of space to take off and land. So in the early 1950s, right, steam catapults were actually introduced because technology was a lot faster. Remember, we went from propeller planes to jet planes, and they just went so much faster. But they still needed an extra push to get off that flight deck. So basically, these airplanes would turn on their engines at full speed, and they'd essentially be slingshotted off of the front of the ship. Launching these planes off was called the cat shot, and they would go from 0 to 150 miles per hour in just about 2 seconds. So it was a very, very fast job. Now, I mentioned a little bit about landing on the Intrepid earlier and how it was a really big deal to do successful landings, right? It was very, very hard. So basically, somebody on board would actually wave the green flag, and they would let the pilot know that, hey, flight deck looks good, come in for a landing. And you'd have this man right here, the landing signal officer, would raise his windscreen right behind him, and he basically directs the plane in and help the pilot land safely on board, whether that was telling him to slow down, speed up, maybe turn to one end, turn to one side. And he'd use those colored paddles to do so. You can kind of see them there in the picture. Right. Later on, when an angled flight deck was installed on the Intrepid, we actually moved to a machine that would actually help those pilots land called an optical landing system. It's also nicknamed the meatball to help them land on board the ship. Now, once the planes were coming in, they would actually put down this tail hook, and you can see it here closer on the right. It's white and black, and it's hook shaped, and basically their job is to come down, release that hook, and they had to catch one of those arrestor cables that were across the top of the ship. Now remember, this ship is going about 40 miles per hour. It's also rocking in the waves, so it was really hard to land on that flight deck. Those planes were also coming in at about 130 miles per hour, so as soon as they landed and they caught one of those, it was going from 130 miles per hour to a full stop, and those cables were basically absorbing that shock. Now, there is a lot happening on this flight deck. You've got a whole crew preparing for taking off, for landing, refueling, restocking these planes in order to get them ready to do everything over again. It's a really dangerous job. Aside from being exposed to the elements, you're taking in a lot of fumes. It's also really, really loud. And so in order to kind of make things easier, everybody was dressed in certain colors, right? And so it would look a little bit like this. And we're going to play a quick little game. And I want you to tell me what color you think does what job. So looking at these colors, right, we've got A and B. Tell me in the chat which uniform color do you think is in charge of preparing the airplanes for flight? Do you think it's the crew in brown on the left or the crew in white on the right? Tell me in the chat which group, which color do you think is in charge of preparing the airplanes for flight? Which color? So if you would have said A, you would have been correct. Brown is in charge of the air. They are the air wing plane captains. They're in charge of making sure that everything is ready for flight and ready for takeoff and everything is safe and ready to go. Awesome. So let's do our next one. So which team color do you think is responsible for refueling? This one's a little bit easier. They also have a really interesting nickname that I'll tell you about in just a second. But which color do you think is responsible for refueling? Tell me in the chat. This is one of the few colors that only actually had one assignment, and there was just to refuel because there was constantly a need to refuel. Yeah, so I see a lot of us. Susie's saying B in the chat. Yeah, so the purple crew was in charge of refueling. They actually have a nickname. They're called the Grapes because they're purple. Awesome. So actually, going back, our red team is actually, they're the ordnance handlers. So they're the crash and salvage crew. So in case anything happened on the flight deck while somebody was coming in, they're in charge of running over and making sure that everything's okay. They also dispose of explosives and ammo. They were also the firefighters on the ship and their damage control. So for our next one, which colored team do you think is in charge of the catapult, so launching those airplanes off, and the arresting gear officers? This one's a little bit harder. Which team do you think is in charge of the arresting gear, so the planes coming in and latching on to those cables, and the catapults? A or B? Let me know in the chat. So if you would have said, where's my mouse here? Green, you would have been correct. They're the arresting cable officers. They're also in charge of cargo handling. They're also hook runners, so they make sure that that hook is inside of the airplane. They also help helicopters land too. They're helicopter landing signalers. And the guys on the blue, they're actually in charge of the aircraft elevator. So when those airplanes are ready to come from the hangar deck, which is inside of the ship, when they are ready to actually come up to launch off the flight deck, they take this huge elevator, and these blue guys are actually in charge of making sure that that aircraft elevator is working properly. I think I have one more. Yes. So which job do you think is in charge, is the aircraft handling officer? Looking at A and B, who do you think is in charge of guiding the pilot on the flight deck and being the plane director? Let me know in the chat. Who do you think is the plane director and guiding the pilot on the flight deck? So I see somebody said A. Yeah, I see Michael say A, Rebecca say A. So yeah, the guys in yellow, they're in charge of making sure and guiding the pilot on the flight deck to make sure that they're going in the right direction and making sure everything's going smoothly when those pilots are on the flight deck. Awesome. So as we wrap up, we're going to use this as a last question break. Do we have any last questions? So what happens if a pilot misses the cable? So if that pilot comes in and they miss the various amounts of arrestor cables loaded across the flight deck, then they actually keep going. So they're coming in at full speed as fast as they can go. They keep coming just in case they miss it. It's called a bolter, and they just keep going, and they actually try again until they reach the cable. Who are the crew in white? So the crew in white, they're actually the medical crew. So they're in charge of the safety. They were also the landing signal officers. So if you noticed in that picture earlier, they were also dressed in white. They're also quality assurance to make sure that everything's going okay. And like I said, they're the medical crew as well. Good questions. So that about wraps it up for today. As you can see, there were many people on board of the Intrepid. There was about 3,000 men on board. They were there from 6 to 9 months. Just about every job you had in your community, you'd also have on board of the ship, plus a little bit more, right? It was kind of like a city at sea. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. The museum has introduced a number of live programs that you can find on our website at intrepidmuseum.org, or you can subscribe to our channel or like us on Facebook. Now, next program is going to be this Thursday, April 29 at 3 p.m. It's Intrepid Women, where you can learn a little bit about how women have made an impact on the air and space industry. Now, once again, the museum is open from Thursday through Sundays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. I hope that you can come check us out. On top of having a large aircraft collection, we have some really neat planes like the Concorde, the A-12. We also have a submarine, the Growler. And we have the Space Shuttle Enterprise as well. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit about what you thought about our program today, we would like for you to answer a quick survey located in the chat. Now, once again, my name is Kara, and thank you for joining me today on another Intrepid adventure. See you next time.